Hello everyone, and this is the video for Math 8, Lesson 4, which is about Chapter 7, Section 1. And this whole section has to do with finding square roots. So just for reference for everybody, this chapter and section starts on page 250. So page 250. But we are going on to the new lesson, which has to do with square roots. Okay, so up to this point, we've covered exponents, scientific notation. Okay, so now we're doing square roots, and the whole point in all of this is we've got to know about all these different types of numbers. Okay, so we got to know how to deal with exponents in order to simplify numbers to figure out what number an exponent means. Okay, or if we've got something written in scientific notation, we need to know what number that is representing. Okay, same thing is going to be true with square roots. So the whole point in us looking at square roots is so that we can see a different type of number, because here in the next few sections, actually after we cover percentages, the whole point in all this is we're going to have to look at any type of numbers. So square roots, scientific notation, exponents, percentages, fractions, decimals, and we're going to have to be able to look at those numbers and tell which one's bigger, which one's smaller. Okay, we'll actually get a test of that in the taste of that in the next lesson. Okay, so lesson 5 later this week, or the next lesson there. So but the first thing that we need to do with this is we need to know what exactly a square root is. So a square root is something that you have probably seen before. Okay, now whether or not that you remember or know how to really evaluate or how to do square roots, you might have forgotten. Okay, and that's the whole point of this section, is for us to talk about what a square root is and know how to evaluate them. Okay, so the first thing we need to talk about here is, what is a square root? Okay, now once again, in math, we're going to be talking about some definitions and stuff here, but if you can't understand what's going on in terms of the words, I know a lot of people have problems looking at definitions and words and knowing what that means in terms of the math. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some notes and some things involving words here first, and then we'll go into the examples and I'll clarify whatever I mean by all of this. Okay, so first things first, we got a square root, and a square root is nothing more than a number that when you multiply it by itself, and we have a special word for multiplying something by itself. So let's say if we do 5 times 5, that means that is 5 squared. Okay, so when we multiply something by itself, we call that squaring the number. Okay, just a little information there where the term square root comes from. But when you multiply a number by itself, that means squaring it. It equals a given number. Okay, so what this means is you're going to be given a number, and when you take the square root of that number, you're finding out what number you have to multiply times itself to get that number. Like I said, in terms of words, that can be kind of hard to think about. Okay, this is just a definition And like I said, people tend to have problems when you're dealing with definitions and understanding what that means in terms of the math. One other term we need to talk about here is what a perfect square is. Okay, a perfect square is one of these numbers up here. Okay, so the given number that we're talking about, perfect square, is a number with what we're going to call, and we'll get more into this in the next section, but what we call integer square roots. Okay, so that means a perfect square is a number. So in the case of 5 times 5 equals 25, well, 25 would then be considered a perfect square because 5 is an integer, okay? And that's what the square root of 25 is 5, okay? Now, 3 other things that we'll look at here before we get into some of the examples, okay? 3 little special cases that we have here is that every positive number actually has 2 square roots. And I'll show you what I mean by this when we look at the next example. But every positive number actually has 2 different square roots that we can have. Okay. This actually isn't in the book, but I did want to go ahead and tell you that 0 has 1 square root. And just to let you know what that square root is, the square root of 0 is 0, okay? And like I said, we'll talk more about that when we get to the first example. And then lastly here, if every positive number has 2 square roots, 0 has 1 square root, then every negative number has no square roots. Okay. That means actually negative numbers don't have any square roots, and we'll talk about why that is here in just a minute. Okay. But let's go ahead and jump into the examples and see what we're even talking about by a square root. Okay. So let's go ahead and look at example 1. Okay. In this case, we're finding square roots of perfect squares. So the actual question here is we need to find the 2 square roots of 49. Now, how you actually find the square root of a number, and I'll show you this here in just a minute, you can actually use a calculator to find out what this is. But where this is a perfect square, this should be one maybe that you could do in your head. So what you need to think about is, what 2 numbers can I multiply times themselves to give me 49? Okay. So the way we need to think about this is, since 7 times 7 is equal to 49, so positive 49 here, 7 is a square root of 49. But notice here, that's just one square root, okay? Every positive number, as we talked about in the last slide there, the last part, was every positive number has two square roots. So here's where we got to be a little bit clever with it, okay? We have 7 times 7 equals 49, but we can also have negative 7 times negative 7. That is also equal to positive 49, okay? So 7 and its opposite. So 7 times 7 is 49. Well, negative 7 times negative 7 is 49. That also means that negative 7 is a square root of 49. Okay? And that's what we mean by every positive number has two different square roots. It has a positive square root because a positive times a positive is a positive. Okay? So positive 7 times positive 7 is positive 49. So that means positive 7 is a square root of 49. But we also have negative times a negative is equal to a positive. So negative 7 times negative 7 is equal to 49. So that also means negative 7 is a square root of 49. Okay? And any square root that you take of any number, okay, any positive number, I should say, there's always going to be two different square roots that you could have, okay? So that's what we're getting at when we're talking about two square roots for every positive number. So just to clarify this even further, let's look at an extra example here. Okay, this is one that's not in the book, but just so everybody's on the same page, just to give you an extra example here. Find the two square roots of 64. Once again, this is what we would call a perfect square, because as you notice, the square roots that we get, they are whole numbers or what we call integers. And if you're not sure what an integer is at this point, we're definitely going to talk about that in the next section, okay? But it's going to have two square roots, so we need to know what two numbers, okay? So what numbers can we multiply times themselves to get 64? Well, if you know your times tables, you would know 8 times 8 is 64. So 64 has a square root of positive 8. But then also negative 8 times negative 8 is also positive 64. Okay? And once again, that's because two positives multiplied together make a positive, and two negatives multiplied together also makes a positive. Okay? And this is where we get into, and we'll actually talk about it in the next little bit of the notes, this is where we get into, well, negative numbers can't have square roots, because if you had a negative number here, well, there's no way you can multiply two of the same number together to get a negative number, okay? And like I said, I'll elaborate on what I mean by that in the next thing. But when you're taking a square root of a number, okay, technically every time you should have two different square roots. So square root of 49 is 7 and negative 7. Square roots of 64 are 8 and negative 8. Square roots of 25 are 5 and negative 5, okay? So any positive number you take the square root of, you should have two square roots, the positive square root and the negative square root. And that's actually what we get into here with the next part of the notes, okay? So we need to figure out how we even write square roots, okay? So how we write square roots. Okay. So with square roots, we have a special symbol that we use, and this is one you've probably seen before. And we call this the radical. Okay. Somebody I've been told before, some way people think about it is it kind of looks like the division, like when you're doing long division. It kind of looks like the division symbol there with a little check mark on the end. Okay. And what this signifies to you, that whatever numbers on the inside of the radical here, okay, kind of like the 49 and the 64 over here, that means we are going to take the square root of that number, okay? But like I said, we've got two different square roots we can possibly have with positive numbers, okay? So we actually have different ways of writing those. So if we specifically wanted the positive square root, okay, positive square root, it would just look something like this. So let's say we wanted the positive square root of 16. Okay, well, the positive square root of 16, if there's no negative sign or nothing in front of the radical, this means you need the positive value of the square root. And the positive square root of 16 is 4, positive 4. Okay, once again, because 4 times 4 is equal to 16. So basically what you're getting out of the square root here is the number that when you multiply it times itself gives you the original number. Okay. Now, on the other side of that, we need to know how to write the negative square root. Okay, so if you're needing specifically the negative square root of a number, it's signified by a negative sign and then the square root. Okay, so negative square root of 16, well, that tells you want the negative square root of 16, which would be negative 4. Okay, once again, negative 4 times negative 4 is equal to positive 16. So that means negative 4 is the negative square root of 16. But then, and this will actually come up later on in class when we talk about the Pythagorean theorem, sometimes you need both square roots at the same time. Okay, and we have a special way of signifying that, and that is with this little symbol here that we call the plus minus, or the plus or minus symbol. So we have plus minus, so it's basically like a plus sign over a negative sign, the square root of 16. And if you have something written like this, this tells you need both the positive and the negative square roots of 16. So that would be 4 and negative 4. Okay? So when you're going through and working problems with square roots, if you just have this symbol right here, that means you just need the positive version of the square root. In this case, positive 4. If you have a negative out front and then the square root, that means that you need the negative of the square root, which is negative 4. So in this case, the negative square root. And then if you have this little symbol right here, so plus minus, okay, plus or minus square root of 16, that's going to be both the positive and the negative square roots. But this is where I need to bring something up, and this is probably the most important thing involving square roots. So when we look at negative square root of 16, we've already said that that is negative 4. Okay, once again, that's the negative square root of 16. That's going to be the negative 4 there. Once again, because negative 4 times negative 4 is equal to 16. But what if I write it like this? And this is a big thing a lot of people mess up on in dealing with square roots. If you have it written like this, notice the negative is actually on the inside of the square root. Okay? And this actually goes back to what we were talking about on the first slide, saying that every negative number has no square roots. Okay? Well, in this case, you'd be taking the square root of a negative number. And once again, since there's no way, and if you think about it logically, there's no way to multiply a positive number times itself and get a negative number. And there's no way to multiply a negative number times itself to get a negative number. So if you see a negative on the inside of a square root, that tells you that there are no square roots, okay? That this actually isn't even a number, and we have a special name for that. And I'll show you what that looks like on the calculator here in just a second. Special word for that means undefined, okay? So the whole point and what I'm trying to make here at the bottom of this page is if the negative's on the outside of the square root, that means you need the negative of the square root of the number that's in here. So in this case, negative square root of 16 is negative 4. But if the negative's on the inside of the radical with the number on the inside of the square root, okay, then that actually doesn't mean anything. That means we don't have a number, okay? So what I'm going to put over here is notice where the negative sign is. Okay. If the negative is on the outside of the square root, that means it's the negative square root. If the negative's on the inside of the square root, that's actually not even a number. That's nothing you need to be concerned with. I mean, well, you need to be concerned with it because you need to know this isn't actually a number. This isn't anything we can calculate. And let me actually go ahead and show you what I mean by looking at the calculator, okay? So this is the calculator that you'll be using in class, okay? And you'll see the square root symbol is this symbol right here. So if you click on that, then you can type in whatever number you want to take the square root of. So in this case, if I wanted to take the square root of 16, just like we were doing, you'll see square root of 16 is 4. But notice that was a positive square root. There's no negative out front. So if you need to take the negative square root, you just put in the minus sign, hit square root, then type in 16, and you notice it's negative square root of 16, which is negative 4. Okay? But now let me show you what I'm talking about with this negative sign on the inside. So if, let's say we do this, and we accidentally put the negative sign on the inside of the square root with the 16. Well, look what happens, okay? If you try to take the square root of a negative number, it's going to give you this thing here that says undefined, okay? And that's basically fancy math talk, meaning this isn't a number, okay? This isn't anything that actually makes sense because, once again, logically think about it. There's no number, so 4 times 4, that's 16. Negative 4, so let me use parentheses, negative 4 times negative 4, well, that is also positive 16, okay? The only way we can get a negative 16 is if we have 4 times negative 4. But then at that point, negative 4 and 4 are not the same numbers, okay? And once again, with square roots, we want that same number multiplied times itself to give us what we're taking the square root of. So in this case, if you scroll back up, 4 times 4 is positive 16. Negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16, okay? But once again, there's no number that we can multiply times itself to give us negative 16. So that's why the square root of negative 16 is what we call undefined. That means it doesn't work. It's not real, okay? It's something that's not there. There's no number that can do that, okay? But that's how we take square roots on the calculator here, is this button, okay? And then we need to type in whatever number it is. So going back to the 7, or the 49, square root of 49 is 7. Well, the negative square root of 49 is also negative 7, okay? So that's how we do square roots on the calculator. But going back to the notes here, let's go ahead and look at another example. So let's go ahead and look at example number 2. Okay, so just finding square roots. So finding square roots, the first square root that they want you to find here is the square root of 25. Okay, now you got to notice here how this is written. There's no negative sign out on the front of the 25 or the square root here. So what that means is we want the positive square root of 25. Okay, and this is one you might be able to do in your head. Since 5 times 5 is 25, the square root of 25 is going to be 5. Okay, and once again, if we wanted to double check ourselves, we could go to the calculator, hit square root of 25, and you could see that that is in fact equal to, in this case, the positive square root of 25 is positive 5. Okay, so once again, you can use the calculator to double check your work there, but once again, there's no negative sign on the front of the square root there, okay, which indicates to you you want the positive square root of 25, which is 5. Part B is a little bit trickier, okay. Here we've got the negative on the outside, but look what we have to take the square root of. We need to take the square root of a fraction, okay? Well, once again, if you've got your handy-dandy calculator, this could be pretty easy, but at the same time, I'm going to show you a little trick that you can do to take the square root of any fraction, okay? So, first off, you notice we've got the negative on the outside of the square root here, so this is a negative square root, so that means our answer is going to be negative, okay? And then we need the square root of 9/16 or 9 over 16. Well, a neat little trick that you can do is if you're taking the square root of a fraction, is you can take the square root of the numerator and divide it by the square root of the denominator. Okay, so technically what we have here is we're going to have a negative. Well, the square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 16 we've already seen is 4. So the answer here is going to be negative 3/4, okay, or negative 0.75. But once again, at the same time, if you've got your calculator, you can take square roots of fractions. So you'd hit square root. These calculators are pretty nice because they actually give you this little fraction button here. So if you click the fraction button, it actually gives you a fraction where you can put in a numerator and denominator, okay? But I almost made a little mistake there. This is the negative square root we're looking for, so we need negative square root. Now let's put in the fraction. So 9/16, okay? And you can see that's negative 0.75, which, if we look back, that's the same thing as negative 3/4. Now, I do want you to be careful here. Some of these questions, okay, they might give you the answer. They might say we want the answer as a fraction, or we want the answer as a decimal, okay? So you do have to be aware on that. So if you do use the calculator here, notice it gives you the answer as a decimal. So in that case, we would need to know how to go and take the decimal and make it into a fraction, okay? Now, if you're not sure how to do that, that's not the purpose of this video, okay? But if you're not sure how to take a decimal and make it back into a fraction, that's something we need to maybe look at. So if you don't know how to do that, maybe if you would let me know, we can maybe do a section before we get done with everything here in terms of all these different types of numbers outside of the book, where we go back and talk about how to switch between fractions and decimals and how to simplify fractions and all that kind of stuff, okay? But as it stands right now, once again, you can use your calculator to get the square roots here. So once again, the answer to A was positive 5 because it was a positive square root of 25, which is positive 5. Here we wanted the negative square root of 9/16, which would be negative 3/4, okay? But now let's look at part C. In this case, we want both the positive and the negative square roots of 2.25. So you can actually take the square roots of decimals as well. And here, there are a couple tricks that you can do to understand how to do this in your head, okay? But if you've got a decimal, the best thing I can tell you to do is use your calculator, okay? So in this case, we want both the positive and negative square roots of 2.25. But one thing you notice on the calculator here, you can't do plus minus square root of 2.25, okay? That gives you just a negative number there. So what we've got to do is we've got to take the positive square root of 2.25, which is 1.5, and we have to take the negative square root of 2.25, which is negative 1.5, okay? So that tells us then, once again, just plugging into the calculator, that both the positive and the negative square roots of 2.25 are 1.5 and negative 1.5, okay? So if you see this little symbol out in front of the square root, okay, this plus minus, that means you want both the positive and the negative square roots of that number, okay? So in this case, positive 1.5 and negative 1.5, okay? If you just see a negative out front of the square root, that means you need the negative of the square root, so negative 3/4 in this case. And then if you don't see a symbol out in front of the square root at all, that means you need the positive square root of 25, which would be positive 5, okay? So once again, pay attention to what's in front of your square root, okay? And then also know how to take the square roots of all these different numbers. So square roots of a perfect square, once again, those are the easiest, because there, once again, you could about almost do that in your head every time. Is 5 times 5 is 25. This one's a little bit more tricky with the fraction, but once again, if you've got the calculator or if you paid attention to this little trick that we can do, it's actually not that bad at all, because if you take the square root of the numerator, well, square root of 9 is easy. 3 times 3 is 9. Square root of 16 is easy. 4 times 4 is 16. So that's going to be a negative 3/4. And then lastly here, square roots of decimals, like I said, there are some tricks that you can do to do square roots of decimals, so maybe to be able to do that in your head. But at the same time, the easiest way to do square roots of decimals are just to plug it into the calculator. But once again, do pay attention to the sign in front of your square root, because that's going to tell you which number that you need, whether it's going to be positive, negative, or if you need both positive and negative. Okay? So let's go ahead and go to the last example. Okay. And the last example here, example 3. This one has to do with evaluating expressions involving square roots. Okay, so we're going to be evaluating expressions just like we've done before, except the new thing we're adding this time, instead of exponents, we're going to have square roots, okay? So what we're asked to do here is evaluate each one of these expressions. And the first expression we're asked to evaluate is 5 times the square root of 36 plus 7. Okay. So when you're evaluating expressions involving square roots, there's one thing that you need to remember. Square roots act like a grouping symbol. So it kind of acts like a set of parentheses, okay? So what I mean by that is, well, if you look at PEMDAS, or GEMDOS, PEMDAS or GEMDOS, well, the first thing that you do is either the parentheses or you do the grouping symbols, okay? Well, in this case, obviously a square root's not a set of parentheses, but it acts as a set of parentheses. So one way you can think about it is whatever's inside the square root, so the square root itself has parentheses around it, and then whatever's on the inside of the square root, it has parentheses around it, okay? And like I said, that'll come more into play when we actually look at part B here, okay? But once again, you kind of think of the square root as having parentheses around it. So when we're going through order of operations, the first thing we're going to need to do here, well, we have multiplication, we have a square root, and we have addition, okay? So the first thing that we're going to need to do here is actually take the square root because it acts as a grouping symbol. So we're going to have 5 times, well, square root of 36, there's no negative out front, there's no plus or minus. That means that's going to be a positive 6 because 6 times 6 is 36. And then actually from here, it works exactly like what we've done before. We have multiplication and addition. That means we need to do the multiplication next. 5 times 6 is 30. And then lastly, 30 plus 7 is 37. Okay? So in regards to working with square roots, you can kind of think of them, like I said, as a grouping symbol. All right? So when you would be doing things in terms of parentheses or grouping symbols, that's when you would do it. So you got to do the square root first here. Okay? But let's go ahead and look at part B. Okay? And this is the one where it's a little bit tricky, once again, because we got fractions. So this expression we need to do is 1/4 plus, and then we've got the square root of 18 over 2. Okay. Once again, we have a square root. So in that case, it kind of acts as a grouping symbol. So when we're going through here, we're not doing anything with the 1/4 yet. So 1/4 plus, well, we got to do what's on the inside here. Well, here, we need to notice, well, 18 divided by 2, that's actually something we can simplify. So this is where the square root kind of acts as grouping symbols. That means on the inside of the square root, we need to do 18 divided by 2 first. And if you do 18 divided by 2, that is 9. Okay. So now the next step, okay, so 18 divided by 2 is 9. Well, now we need to actually take the square root. So once again, there's no negative symbol out here. Okay, so this isn't the negative square root of 9. We want the positive square root of 9, which is positive 3. And then from here, knowing how to deal, which this isn't the purpose of this video, so if you have any trouble with understanding what I'm doing here, once again, I might just go ahead and throw up. I've got a resource or a worksheet that people can do and look at that tell you how to deal with mixed numbers, fractions, how to simplify fractions, add fractions, multiply fractions, and all that kind of stuff. But if we have 1/4 plus 3 as a mixed number, that is 3 and 1/4, okay? But that's also the same thing as 3.25. And like I said, I'm not going to go through it all here, but that is also the same thing as 13 over 4. So given that number in all the different ways you could have it here, that's either 3 and 1/4 as a mixed number, 3.25 as a decimal, or 13 over 4, so 13/4 as an improper fraction. And like I said, if you have issues with going from here to any one of these answers here, that's something we need to address because that's going to be one of the things. They might have your answers in mixed number form, so you need to know what this is as a mixed number. You need to know what it is as a decimal, and you need to know how to get it into improper fraction form, okay? And that's something that we'll see throughout the year. But like I said, not the purpose of this video, so I'm going to leave it here for right now. But that means these are the answers. It's 1/4 plus 3 is 3 and 1/4, 3.25, or 13 divided by 4. Now the last example here, so last of the questions here, part C, we have parentheses, square root of 81, close parentheses, squared minus 5. So what this gives us here is square root of 81 squared minus 5. Well, if you're clever about it, we actually call the square root and the square inverse operations, okay? So in one way you can think about this is saying, well, I'm taking the square root of 81, but then I'm squaring it. That's going to give me 81. But we can actually do this order of operations wise. So in this case, we've got parentheses. So first thing we need to do is inside the parentheses. Well, inside the parentheses is a square root. And the positive square root of 81 is positive 9. Okay. And now this works just like any other PEMDAS or order of operation questions. 9 squared is 81. 81 minus 5 is 76. Okay, so once again, it kind of works as a grouping symbol. So here we had a grouping symbol inside of a grouping symbol, as it were. So we had to do the square root first before we squared the number. Okay, and like I said, it might be a little confusing here because, or if you're clever, you can see, all right, I took the square root of 81 and I squared it. Well, what did I get out? 81. Okay, but like I said, that's something you'll talk more about next year in algebra. As for us, just take the square root of whatever number's in here, get that number, and then you can square it, okay? And then once again, order of operations always hold, so 81 minus 5 is 76, okay? So use this video, use these notes, okay? They'll be posted. These notes will be posted with the video, okay? So make sure you go through, understand all the different types of questions here, so how to take square roots and how to evaluate square roots in an expression. And that's what you're going to be practicing with on the practice and the homework for this section, okay? But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me or let me know because square roots in this case are very important, okay? So we need to know how to do square roots because there's going to be actually a couple more things later on in the year where we're going to have to know how to deal with square roots in order to do what we need to do there, okay? But other than that, thanks for watching and good luck with the practice.